The one that we worked at the most, Urbulagin, measured 400 by 400 meters. The central mound was 2, 3, 4 meters tall. I can't remember. There were about 1,000 stone circles all around, and there was this fence. So it was a gigantic site, clearly not built in a single season or a single month even. It must have taken a while to build, unless there was a concentration of population, which we don't typically associate with nomadic pastoralist populations groups. The question becomes, if you look at the entire span of Mongolian prehistory and early history, is why at different times did these dispersed groups come together to build these very labor-intensive constructions?
Hi everyone, my name is Mikhail Rodin. This is the Прошлое channel, which means the past, and the Crossroads 2 project. We are doing it in collaboration with archaeologists Igor Chechushkov and Ivan Semyan. Today we will talk to Dr. Francis Allard about how the small number nomads in Mongolia were able to build huge 400-meter stone mounds. We will also discuss what ritual complexes called Khirigsuurs tell us about nomadic societies at the end of the 2nd millennia BC.
All right. My name is Francis Allard. I'm a teacher near Pittsburgh at the University of Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Been teaching there for 20 years in the Department of Anthropology. My professional or academic path is maybe a little bit unusual. What it took to get here, I started off in pure and applied sciences, and then did a degree in marine biology in Canada. I come from, I'm Canadian, from Montreal. Followed by, at that point when I graduated with my marine biology degree, I thought about going into medicine, becoming a doctor, but then thought that wasn't such a great idea, for me at least, and moved to Hong Kong, where I lived for a few years and worked as a high school teacher, teaching French, which is my mother tongue, native language, English, mathematics. And that was the beginning of really my interest and focus on East Asia. While in Hong Kong, I met an archaeologist, did a little bit of archaeology in Hong Kong and decided to pursue that. So I then went to Cambridge University in England and did a degree there in 2 years. A degree that was very theoretically oriented, maybe in contrast to other archaeology programs in Europe. Ian Hodder was there, Colin Renfrew, so there were a lot of theoretically focused lectures, and graduated with therefore my second bachelor's degree, and at that point didn't know what I was going to do, so I decided I needed to find work. So I needed another degree, I thought, and moved to Toronto and went to University of Toronto to get a master's in museum studies, thinking that I was going to work in a museum. But what happened was I spent a lot of time at the Royal Ontario Museum working with the East Asian collections. And in my last semester, I won a scholarship to go to China. So I spent 1 semester there in Nanjing studying museums and taking classes at the university there. And it's only in 1988, by that time I'm 29 years old, that I decided to combine my two loves, my two interests, China and archaeology, and applied to do a PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in the United States. And I started that PhD in 89 and graduated in 95. At that time, there were very few programs that had professors, advisors, mentors who could guide a student in East Asian archaeology. Some of them were art historians, some of them were archaeologists, but of course at that time it was not possible to do archaeological field work in China, not until the early 90s at least. I did my field work in southern China in Guangdong province in the early 90s. And like I said, graduated in 1995. By the way, my field work was not that far from Hong Kong, so I've always had a specific interest in southern China. So for the next 5 years, I taught as an adjunct, as a lecturer at various universities near Pittsburgh, in Ohio, in West Virginia even, and finally got my job at Indiana University of Pennsylvania in 2002, 2003 is when I started my tenure track position. In the meantime, in 2000, I met at the University of Pittsburgh a visiting scholar from Mongolia, an archaeologist. And we started to talk about archaeology in Mongolia. And I was fascinated. I'd never been to Mongolia. Very few people had. And decided to visit that very summer in 2000. Of course, in my mind, I always thought I would be returning to southern China to do field work, to continue field work, but there was yet another detour in my professional trajectory, and I ended up in Mongolia that summer, traveling around central Mongolia in a van. We had a driver and a historian, a Mongolian historian, and came across these amazing archaeological sites. And because, of course, these are the grasslands, and there's very low sedimentation, plus the fact that the majority of these sites are built of stones, you can see the sites from the road, if you're in fact on a road at that point. So there were all these stone-built sites everywhere, and I became really fascinated by them. Unfortunately, the historian that I traveled with was more familiar with more recent Mongolian history and was not able to answer the many questions I had about the dates of the sites, the functions of the structures. And there was one particular incident that I recall that really changed things for me. There was a big thunderstorm, and we had to stop because we couldn't see anything. And when the rain let up, I got out of the van, and we were very close to, in fact, almost within one of these stone-built sites at Khirigsuurs, which I'll talk about later. And it was absolutely gigantic. I climbed on top of the central mound. Again, everything was built of stone, and saw all around me these structures. To the east, there were well over 1,000 smaller stone mounds, and then all these other structures and platforms all around. We ended up studying this site, which was in fact 400 by 400 meters, so it was a very large Khirigsuurs. And when I asked the historian what these smaller mounds were and what they contained, he said he wasn't sure. So that was it. That's what did it for me. And I thought, well, this is where I want to work. I need to find out what's in those mounds. And I did.
You mentioned that your studies at Cambridge focused on theory. Could you explain what theory means in archaeology and why Cambridge University is renowned for its theoretical approach, even to the extent of not requiring fieldwork experience?
Right. At that point, as you mentioned, I realized, and I don't know if this is entirely correct, but it may be correct, that this was the only archaeology program that did not require fieldwork. There was, like we're discussing, a strong archaeology program with really famous archaeologists who were very theoretically oriented. Cambridge has a long history of scholarship and, for example, social anthropology, so there was that kind of connection. Now, unlike North America, where anthropology departments stand on their own and incorporate archaeologies within the anthropology department, here we had a separate independent archaeology department, but still there was all this scholarship at Cambridge with cultural anthropologists, really, social anthropologists they call themselves, and there was that kind of interaction, and the department just attracted a lot of people who were interested in theory. It was very dynamic. I can't really say. I'm not sure why specifically Cambridge ended up doing that, but it was very distinctive. I remember my first archaeology. So I'm arriving there thinking they're going to teach me how to use a trowel, how to set up a grid. But my first lecture with Ian Hodder was about Marxist archaeology. And I really didn't know where I was at that point, and I had to catch up. And it was pretty challenging. But, those types of lectures with those professors combined with the tutorials really forced the student to improve their writing skills, their critical thinking skills, and become very familiar with archaeological theory. And but at the end, there was still no field school. So instead of a field school, we took a bus tour through Northern Europe to visit archaeological sites. So I never learned archaeological field methods at Cambridge. And I had to find my own field sites to work on. And so I worked in Epirus in northern Greece with Jeff Bailey and a Bronze Age site up the Thames, and gained some field experience there. In the end, I think that particularly in relation to my own interests, which I have to admit have become increasingly theoretical as opposed to method-oriented, method-based, or field method-based. I think that program ultimately fit my interests and inclinations much more. So it was an interesting program. But I graduated with limited field experience and really not sure whether I wanted to do a PhD. So that's why I ended up, I thought, well, I need to work and make a living. So I thought a master's in museum studies is going to get me a job in a museum. But once again, I was derailed by in this case, a scholarship to go to China. There was a scholarship between the province of Jiangsu in China and set up, there was a collaboration between Jiangsu province in China and Ontario province in Canada. And I ended up in China again. And it's at that point that I decided to combine my interest in archaeology and China into a profession. But then I had to find the right type of program. And like I said before, there were very few people in North America or in Australasia who were able to be my professors. And luckily I found a wonderful program at the University of Pittsburgh. And so that was my story.
What types of questions were asked at Cambridge? What problems does archaeology aim to solve?
Discussions were about, functionalism and Marxism. And of course, this was the program, and the scholars there were associated with, the early stages of post-processual archaeology. So they were already, at this point, and we're talking now in the mid-'80s, they were already thinking critically about what other archaeologists were thinking about and doing in other parts of the world associated with processual archaeology. So there were all these paradigms and theories that were put forward as a way to think about archaeology more critically, and that's what we were trained in, right? And so there were a lot of discussions and arguments and disagreements about the benefits and the limitations of processual archaeology, something that we're all familiar with by now. But a lot of these ideas came out of programs like the Cambridge program. of course, especially Ian Hodder, who was at the forefront of that. But again, for someone who was looking to learn how to use a trowel, Ian Hodder was quite a revelation. To take a theoretical perspective to in whatever type of archaeology we did at that time, whatever material we were exposed to, meant something very different than what I was expecting. So I was very surprised, and ultimately I found it really, really interesting. It was a real challenge, I have to tell you, to write, because I came from a science background, and by then my English I was quite fluent, but I'd never written much in English, and the tutorial system there works like other universities. Regularly, once or twice a week, I'd have papers to write, and I'd go meet the professor, sometimes in their house, and yes, sometimes with a cup of tea, and we'd discuss the topic. They would have assigned some readings to me, and I would have to write. This is before computers and before editing, so everything was written by hand. And I can tell you, I struggled at the beginning. In fact, my writing was quite poor, I was told. And so I had to work really hard at writing clearly. And it took a while, and I think those requirements really had a positive impact on my career in the end.
Let's return to Mongolia. What makes archaeology in this country so attractive to North American archaeologists? After all, Soviet archaeologists had already done quite a lot of research by the early 1990s.
Well, I'd say that Mongolian archaeology, Mongolia was appealing to American archaeologists, Western archaeologists, for several reasons. Some of them have to do with kind of the setting and the logistics of the place. But also, there were interpretive opportunities beyond the field work that were not available maybe in other parts of the world. So there was a combination of a lot of those things. There was, of course, theory going on being proposed before American archaeologists got there. The Russian archaeologists were interested, first of all, in the basic, cultural historical framework of, typology and dating. The main theoretical context within which interpretations were provided really had to do with, ideas such as migration and diffusion and ethnicity and nationalism and origins and topics like that, which by then had lost their appeal in American archaeology. So American archaeologists came to Mongolia asking very different kinds of questions. I should add that my program at the University of Pittsburgh, one of my advisors was Dr. Dick Drennan, who is, of course, well known for his work in the archaeology of complex societies and settlement patterns. So that was the theoretical framework that I was carrying with me, and that had, of course, a very big impact on myself and all of his students. So more specifically, just going to Mongolia and discovering these amazing sites in this wonderful landscape was enough of a reason, I think, for a lot of archaeologists to just move their office there and start doing archaeology in Mongolia. You have sites that are made of stone that are very visible in very open landscapes. So it's grasslands. There are no towns on top of the sites, so they're very accessible. On top of that, Mongolian archaeologists were interested in collaborating with Western archaeologists at that time. So there was this somewhat easier there. Logistically, it was complicated. Of course, working in the middle of the steppes is complicated. You have to carry a lot of your equipment, and in our case, a lot of food, like fruit and vegetables and other foods as well, in big trucks. And so you have these little convoys that end up in the middle of the steppes, really, and you set up camp and become the biggest settlement in the entire valley. So that was challenging, but the opportunities were great. I'll add also that here was a place where we could test some of our ideas, right? And, many of us in American archaeology had been trained to think about the emergence of complex societies in the States from the perspective of central places, urbanism, for example. And here was a setting in which at various times over the course of Mongolian prehistory and early history, you had the emergence of state-like societies or very complex polities that were not centered on large places where we don't see urbanism. So here was another path to complexity. So that provided, like I said, real opportunities to see how different regions of the world had been the setting for the development of highly complex societies, complex polities, following different trajectories. So from a theoretical standpoint, this was a wonderful chance to try to test some of our ideas. And then finally, I think another reason, something that archaeologists maybe don't explicitly recognize all the time, is that here was a landscape inhabited by nomadic pastoralists. That lifestyle of nomadic pastoralism, mobile pastoralism, where people move with their herds regularly during the year, appears to have been a similar lifestyle, life way, as existed through 2,000-3,000 years ago. So here was this other wonderful opportunity to study present-day inhabitants of the steppes in Mongolia as a way to understand the past. The level of continuity was amazing, and it's something that we all took advantage of. I think, whether, like I said, we recognize this explicitly or implicitly. It certainly played a role in my own project as I was trying to answer some questions. Where else in the world can you turn to someone who lives 1 kilometer away and ask them questions that will help you understand the way people lived in that same spot 3,000 years ago? So for a lot of reasons, Mongolia became very appealing to American archaeologists, and we know that now more and more archaeologists from North America and even Australasia, Japan, Korea spend a lot of time carrying out fieldwork projects there. I'll end this section by saying that ultimately I decided to stop my project, which I had started in 2001. I went up to 2008 to return to China. I decided to go back to South China and continue doing field work there. And I'm now involved in a research project that focuses on China and the South China Sea, the early maritime Silk Road. So again, really far away to the south. But I remember my project, my time in Mongolia, very, very fondly, and it really had an impact on how I view archaeology and developmental trajectories of complex societies.
For what purpose and using what methods did you excavate the Khirigsuurs?
When you end up in an archaeological landscape like this, you start asking questions immediately. But the first thing you have to do is figure out what you're looking at, right? So the spatial temporal pattern that you have to deal with. So here were these Khirigsuurs, and there were quite a few of them spread in the valley of Hanoi, where the project was located. And they were all made of stone. They ranged in site from very small sites to very large one, including the one that I mentioned some time ago. And these sites were structured in a very particular way, which was the first thing that we noticed. They had a central mound made of stones. There was a rectangular fence made of surface stones around the mound. On the east and south side, there were these small mounds that I mentioned before. There were other structures, and interestingly, at the very periphery, all around the site, there were these stone circles. So the first thing there were kind of two basic aspects to the parts to the project. One was to excavate parts of the site to see what was in these structures, and through that also date them through radiocarbon dating. And the other one was to survey the valley to try to say something about their distribution. So we did all of that. What we found is that the sites, like I said, were very similar. They were oriented in a particular direction, which was really fascinating, which raised questions right away. And this we found only after surveying a lot of these Khirigsuurs. We excavated a lot of these small mounds and found horse heads, horse skulls, also pointed in a particular direction. And these sites, it became apparent very quickly, were ritual sites. There was no evidence of habitation on those sites. In fact, we now think that they date between maybe the 12th and the 10th century BC. And at that time, just as now, people lived a mobile pastoralist lifeway. In fact, we also know by now through other fieldwork by others that these sites were relatively small and temporary, and these Khirigsuurs stood out as the most prominent labor-intensive structures of these mobile pastoralist societies. So one question right away was, who built these? Why did they build these? Do mobile pastoralist societies typically build these kinds of structures? And then related to that, what were the rituals associated with these sites? What ritual function did the sites as a whole have, as well as the different structures, and also who was buried, what was under the central mound?
How labor-intensive was it to build the central mounds of the Khirigsuurs?
So, like I said, the one that we worked at the most, Bulagin, measured 400 by 400 meters. The central mound was 2, 3, 4 meters tall. I can't remember. These small mounds to the east and south that contained horse heads, which I'll talk about in a second. We counted them. There were over 1,500 of them. There were about 1,000 stone circles all around, and there was this fence. So it was a gigantic site. And one night, made a rough calculation, there were probably 500,000 stones, large stones, used in the construction of the site. Clearly not built in a single season or a single month even. It must have taken a while to build, unless there was a concentration of population, which we don't typically associate with nomadic pastoralist populations groups. So that was truly amazing. And some of the sites were much, much smaller and would have taken less time to build. But they were all oriented in about the same way and all had the same structure. There was a way of building these sites that was very, very consistent. So that was really interesting. Shall I go on about what we found out about the structure? Yeah. So, like I said, one of the first things we noticed was that the sites seemed to be oriented in a particular direction. Now, at that time, we didn't know whether they were oriented toward the east or toward the west. But in fact, the orientation was between 90 degrees and 135 degrees, so from east to southwest. They were either pointing toward the east, to southeast or toward the west and northwest. So before addressing this question of what they were pointing to, we figured out that they were probably pointing toward the east or southeast. And this was determined by looking at the length of the surface fence around the central mound. I went around and made a lot of calculations, and people often asked what I was doing. I was being very particular and meticulous about measuring these fences, and noticed that the east fence was about 10 to 15% shorter than the west fence. And I found that quite intriguing, and I thought maybe the answer about the site's direction has to do with that. So we tried something, and I asked 5 students to come with me one morning. Middle of the steps, they had flags. So 4 of them had flags, and there was one manager. And this manager was supposed not to move, was immobile. And I asked the manager, who was in charge of building the sites or setting the corners of that rectangle, the first step in building the site, I thought, to ask the other 4 students to place the flag down where he or she thought, or the manager thought, would produce a perfect rectangle. So the manager would say, okay, move a little bit to the right, to the front. Okay, put your flag down. We did that multiple times, and we measured this perimeter, and in every case, the side furthest away from the manager was 10 to 15% shorter than the side closer to the manager. I subsequently learned that this is a psychological effect called the keystone effect. There's nothing too mysterious about it, but what it suggested to me was that when they first set the perimeter stones, or the cornerstones of the perimeter around the central mound, they were facing toward the east or southeast. The manager, whoever, right? So, of course, it's no proof, but it was a strong suggestion. Then we still had this question: why are these sites oriented from 90 to 135 degrees? And by the way, at this point, we know that they're not pointing to some mountain or tree or anything like that, because the Khirigsuurs in other parts of Mongolia, including northern Mongolia, are also ranging between 90 and 135 degrees. And then we excavated the stone mounds and found not human remains, but like I said before, horse skulls, often with the neck vertebra placed right alongside, and the hooves placed right alongside the skull. Lo and behold, interestingly, the horse skulls also, the direction also ranged between 90 and 135 degrees.
Like the face of the horse.
Yes, the front of the horse. That's right, the teeth. So this matched the orientation of the sites. Again, we don't know what they're pointing to. The only possible explanation, because of the consistency and the range of orientations at different Khirigsuurs in different parts of Mongolia, was that the sites and the horse heads were pointing towards something in the sky. Of course, this is in 2001 and 2, and there's no internet, and I barely have a phone line where I can talk to my family once in a while on a satellite phone for 30 seconds. So there's no research I can do. But I did manage to ask my wife whether what the orientation of the sun was, because I thought, is it the moon? Is it Venus? Is it another celestial body? Is it the sun? And she shared with me some of the setting of the sunrise at different times of the year at that latitude, of course, right? And if the sites and the horse heads were pointing toward the sun, they would have been pointing toward the sun, where the sun rises between from October to December over that 2-month period. So this led to this hypothesis that these sites had been planned, at least, maybe not completed, but planned during the month of October and December. And during that period of time, the horse mounds were also built, and the horses were sacrificed, and the horses were placed on the ground to also point toward the sun at that time. So in October, the sunrise rose at about 90 degrees, and then it went down to 135 by mid-December, and then went back. So the hypothesis was that these sites had been planned and initially built during those months, and the horses sacrificed also at that time. But this was just a hypothesis. And this led to a new trajectory, really, for the project, which was to incorporate an ethnographic research project, something which I'd never thought about, and I'm not a cultural anthropologist, and I'd never done an ethnographic project. But I thought, what if people in the valley, living in the valley at that time, and these were mobile pastoralists who lived in gers and had herds, and they moved twice a year in the valley. What if they're able to help us understand what happens to these horses? And I already knew that families typically most families ate one horse per year. So they would take a horse from their herd, often an old horse or a very young horse, and they would eat it. So I thought, maybe there's something there. Maybe we can gain some insight. So we had an ethnographic project which we carried out for 3 years and interviewed a lot of families. We had a set of questions. We had a questionnaire, and we would ask questions like, how many horses do you eat a year? How do you kill your horse? What do you do with the body parts? Why is the horse important? What do you do with the skull? And why? And one interesting thing I can begin with is that horse sacrifice was probably prevalent in ancient Mongolia, but many hundreds of years ago, the practice was stopped, and people do not sacrifice horses at this stage. And if you ask them, they would say, "Well, I just, eat a horse every year because I need food. I mean, it's simply for consumption." But interestingly, when you ask them, what do you do with the different parts of the horse, they would say, "Well, I hang the kidney at the right side of the door, and the vertebrae, I do this with the vertebrae." Clearly, there were some ritual echoes of an earlier sacrificial practice, but that's not how they viewed the killing of their horse. The horse was clearly very important. In fact, they associated the horse with the sun. The most important result for us is, when do you kill the horse? And it was, in fact, for most families, between October and December. Why? Because by killing the horse then, they can then freeze it for the winter, and maybe it provides food after the winter, or during the winter if they run out of food. So that's how they explained it. And what do you do with the skull? Well, the skull, we take it out, and here it wasn't 100% of respondents, but a majority said they took the skull out and would place it on a mountain or on the ground facing east. They said either facing east or facing the sun. They never said facing, a mountain, for example. So here was support for this initial idea we had based on the archaeological data, the orientations of the sites and the horses, that there was an association between horses and the sun, and that this practice had been maintained Of course, when they watched us excavate the horse skulls from under the mounds, because they would often come and see our excavations, they wondered why someone would have buried a horse skull under a mound. But in some way, they were still doing the same thing. And in northern Mongolia, I came across several horse skulls that had not been placed on the ground, I mean present-day horse skulls, but in a tree on a branch. They would have placed slotted the horse skull into one of the branches. And typically these horses faced east as well, on the east side of the tree. So there was tremendous consistency. And returning to one of the benefits of working in Mongolia, which I mentioned earlier, here was a practice that had been transformed, but that also displayed continuity over, in this case, thousands of years. Something that archaeologists, working in other parts of the world, rarely can take advantage of, right? So this was really appealing. So it certainly wasn't no proof that our interpretation was correct, but I think it's pretty strong support. And then, which leads us to, I think, who built these sites and when and why, right?
Yeah.
How can we explain the construction of labor-intensive Khirigsuurs in a sparsely populated area? Is it the result of religious beliefs and related ritual activities? Or are they a reflection of social processes? Or is it a mixture of both?
Before I address specifically that question, I'd like to mention what you've just brought up, this issue of low population densities. I mean, we need to start with kind of the environmental setting within which all of this is happening. And the setting is one in which people are living at low population densities. They're mobile. They're moving with their herds, right? The carrying capacity of the landscape, of the grasslands, is limited. So the question becomes, if you look at the entire span of Mongolian prehistory and early history, is why at different times did these dispersed groups come together to build these very labor-intensive constructions? So during the Bronze Age, between the 12th and the 9th or 8th century BC, what you have are these Khirigsuurs, which were very labor-intensive. Later on, starting in the 2nd century BC, you've got the Xiongnu that also have huge cemeteries, very labor-intensive graves. Later, in the first millennium AD, you have these Turkic sites. And you have walled sites as well. So why at various times over the course of Mongolian prehistory and history do we have dispersed population who for some reason come together to do something special, maybe unusual from the perspective of this long span of time? Was it, were there some special incentives? Was it coercion? Was it, ideological coercion or military coercion or some kind of incentive, some reason why people came together? So the Khirigsuur phenomenon that lasted many centuries and where it was very consistent is just one of those instances where people came together for some reason and spent a lot of effort building these sites. I'll also add something else as part of the context. I mean, mobile pastoralist societies do come together, and we know this ethnographically, at various times of the year to meet and to exchange marriage partners, to collaborate, to exchange news. So there's nothing unusual with the idea that dispersed population come together at various times during the year. The question is, in the case of the Khirigsuurs, why did that happen, that phenomenon happen at that time, and what were they actually doing? And it remains a mystery, Igor. We don't know, but here are some interesting possibilities. You can view, so these central mounds contained burials, right? Most of the central mounds contain burials, but with very little inside. The individuals were not buried with a lot of burial goods. Now, I'll qualify this by saying that many of these central mounds were in fact looted. But there doesn't seem to have been these rich, really very wealthy burials at the center of these stone mounds. So we can view this, I think, from two different perspectives. One of them is these were leaders, respected leaders, and their importance, their status, their power was not expressed through material wealth, but through the labor expended in their support, in supporting the building of their central mound burial and all of these ritual activities that took place around them. So one possibility is that these sites were built in their honor, right? And they were powerful leaders. And that power and status and respect was expressed not through stuff, through things, through rich burials, but through the communal efforts of, what were basically fundamentally dispersed populations coming together and building this huge site in their honor that included rituals that involved the sun, that involved the horses. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at this is that, so if this is correct, this again provides another opportunity to see the development of power and complex societies in a different way, along a different trajectory, which is not associated with material wealth, but rather through expenditure of labor. Okay? Another way to look at this is that these were not powerful leaders. They might have been respected individuals. And this was a group-oriented or a communally oriented society. And the sites are really ritual sites aimed for the benefit of the entire group of people who came together for those few months to build the sites and to carry out these rituals and to sacrifice their own horses, most probably, right? And that the individual at the center may simply have been more symbolic of the group's identity.
Perhaps such a person was even a victim.
Even a sacrifice, maybe, yes. So that rather than what's been called a network or individualizing society, right, would actually have been a group-oriented society in which the focus was not on the individual and his or her power or wealth, but rather on the group that finds and expresses its identity through one of them, their own, right? I don't know how to answer that question. I think both possibilities are reasonable, and we used to have discussions about this. Who's buried? Is it the chief? Is this a group-oriented society in which some individual was symbolically sacrificed or symbolizes group identity? Because these sites, when you look at these sites, it's truly amazing. I mean, the focus is on ritual, right? The mound in the center is the center. It's the spatial center, but possibly the site took on importance in another way as a ritual site and a place for people to gather, dispersed groups to gather. When groups return to the site seasonally, because in the case of Urtbulagin, it's 500,000 stones, there's no way they constructed that in a single season. The stones had to be taken from the hills at the edges of the valley, because there are no stones at the bottom of the valley. So when they returned, did that person who had been buried in that central mound maintain his or her importance, right? that site continued to function as a ritual site and a place of gathering. So I don't know whether we're looking at an individualizing social system or a group-oriented social system, or all these oppositions have been, these other kinds of vocabulary have been used, right?
If we compare the sequence of changes in funeral rites and ritual activities in Mongolia and Colombia in the upper reaches of the Magdalena River, we seem to see similar features. First, extremely labor-intensive tombs with few grave goods appear, and then they are replaced by individual burials with a large number of objects. In Mongolia, Khirigsuurs are replaced by the slab grave culture, and then by the Xiongnu. Could this indicate similar social processes?
Well, in the case of the Xiongnu, so we surveyed and mapped Golmod II, a very, very large Xiongnu cemetery. And in that case, we're really looking at developmental trajectories focused on individuals. Some of the burials were that have been excavated with ramps were very, very large and contained a lot of material. And a lot of that material actually showed the connections with China. So a lot of Chinese material was ending up in these very wealthy Xiongnu burials. In the case of the Xiongnu, yeah, you've got leaders, you've got individuals, you've got people in charge who are recognized as the leaders. In the case of the Khirigsuurs, and coming back to the Alta Magdalena and the Oaxaca distinction, I'd like to say this, that again, if you find an individual that is more kind of integrated into the society, right? It's one type of leadership, right? But at that point, can you really tell whether that individual is a leader who's recognized as playing a role within the communal setting, or someone who symbolizes the group, who is not actually a very powerful leader to begin with? There's a range there. And that's what I meant with the Khirigsuurs. It's really hard to tell whether we're looking at an individual whose power and status is not expressed through material wealth, but rather through labor-intensive behavior linked to rituals, or it's someone who really has no power, who is more symbolic of the group, and as you said, something I'd not thought about before, a sacrifice, right? So where that individual who has this central place really stands as an instance of the entire group, represents the entire group, rather than being a powerful leader. So it's hard to distinguish between these two possibilities in my mind.
A comparison with the Xiongnu suggests that there weren't many items in the Khirigsuurs, because even the plundered Xiongnu burial mounds still contain a lot of grave goods, don't they?
Well, the Xiongnu burials were looted, but there's still a lot of material inside. We excavated some smaller burials, and they had been looted, but there was still material inside. In the cases of the central mounds, it's always a possibility that these burials, these individuals in the central mounds were buried with a lot of material. But I think it's unlikely. To excavate, to loot a stone mound is really complicated, because to get at the bottom of a stone mound, the stone mound at Utbulagin, this large Khirigsuurs I was talking about, you could see a dip on the side where it had obviously been looted in the past. But it's hard to get because the entire mound falls on you, right? So those mounds that have been excavated, in some cases they didn't even find human remains, But when they did, they found very little material, which actually which is in line with the material culture during the Bronze Age at this time. People in general, there wasn't that much material that people were buried with, right? Burials tended to be simple and relatively poor. And this central mound, interestingly, just the same type of behavior, but in this case under a labor-intensive construction. So I don't know what the answer is to that.
The Khirigsuurs phenomenon existed for quite a long time, but the question is why it remains so stable.
So I've been very interested in the topic of memory. So these are, of course, pre-literate societies. And so, to me, this suggests that right from the beginning, ritual specialists who passed along over centuries ways of doing things. I mean, I can't go in. There's no time to go into detail. But when you look at the specific structural elements of Khirigsuurs, beyond their orientation, you'll notice very small details of how particular structures are organized and where they're located that is replicated from one site to the next, whether these sites are contemporary or not, even all the way to northern Mongolia. The behavioral consistency is amazing, really. And to me, in a pre-literate society, suggests ritual specialists who were involved in the construction of these sites. They must have been. Otherwise, you would have seen some kind of behavioral drifting, right? Where the sites start to look different very, very quickly. Not just temporally, but also spatially as well. And that's not what we find. So the consistency in these, the structural and behavioral consistency in these sites is really noteworthy. And implies to me a particular sector of society that was involved in ritual life that played obviously a huge role in their society.
But we don't see burials of this kind of specialist, do we?
Yeah, I mean, would they be buried with other types of materials, for example? It's very enigmatic. It's this last 300-400 years, and then suddenly, as you pointed out, during the Iron Age, first million BC, they disappear, and now you have slab burials. Now, slab burials are very labor intensive as well. In fact, I would be more comfortable saying that the slab burials are associated with individualizing systems than the Khirigsuurs themselves. Because those are individual burials that required a lot of work to build, and these individuals are often buried with metals or other artifacts. By the 2nd century BC, by the end of the Iron Age, though, with the Xiongnu, these individualizing societies really become very obvious, right? It is, and now by then you have a very complex polity, which some state-like a polity that was very expansive. So you have a very different kind of system. But again, as I said earlier, ultimately the default appears to be a return after some time to more dispersed population.
That is, we see not only changes in material culture, but also social changes. Can we say that this type of society had the potential for a longer existence, given the longevity of the Khirigsuurs culture?
People have often made these distinctions between individualizing and group-oriented societies. There's staple and wealth-financed societies. There's network societies. I've also tried to look for that distinction in with the archaeological material in southern China, actually throughout China, and you can find in Chinese prehistory and early history instances, examples of societies that fall into the individualizing end of the spectrum, and some at the group-oriented end of the spectrum. But what I found that really interesting is that the individualizing societies tend to be shorter-lived than the group-oriented societies, and I gave those different names. I call them dislocated versus integrated societies. So dislocated societies are societies in which, and I'm talking about the Chinese case here, the dislocated societies are societies in which the leadership is literally, spatially, and ideologically separated from the rest of society. Their burials are in another place. Their burials are structured differently. They have a lot more things. Burial wealth is often very significant. They often have exotic materials, some of them from far away. They are dislocated. They're separated from the rest of society. Versus integrated societies where leaders are buried in larger burials with more material, but their burials are within the confines of the group cemetery, right? If you look at how long these groups last, it appears that these integrated systems last longer than the dislocated systems. If that is so, and there are several instances of that, I think, in ancient China. If that is so, we've got with the Khirigsuurs phenomenon possibly a group-oriented system, right? What I would call an integrated system that lasted for a very long time and whose features, structurally and behaviorally, are consistent also over a very long time, pointing to stability. So the stability of a group-oriented system, the same thing, this is what we were talking about. But if this is so, that person buried in the central mound played a role in a group-oriented society. They were not leaders that, even though they're in their separate mound in the center of the site, they may not have been aggrandizers. They may not have been individuals who stood out from everyone else. These are not the chiefs, the wealthy and powerful chiefs, if this is correct, but rather just individuals that symbolize the group. Again, a group-oriented society. So my guess is, returning to the initial question, is that we're looking, when we talk about the Khirigsuurs phenomenon, at integrated social systems, group-oriented systems that display significant stability over time, because why are dislocated systems unstable? Well, in ancient times, in many parts of the world, without coercive powers, without a police force, without a military, how do you convince people to support you, right? So, dislocated system or individualizing social systems may be less stable because of the difficulty of that leadership to continue to maintain support from the rest of the population. In the case of the Khirigsuurs, if these were just if these individuals buried under the central mound were simply expressions of group identity almost, then we don't have that problem. We have a stable system that relies on group identity and group behavior associated with ritual, in this case, rituals associated with the sun. So that's my guess.
How useful is your theory that integrated societies are more stable and asymmetrical ones are unstable as a lesson for the present day?
I think it's tempting to make parallels between the ancient world and the modern world, and propose what you just said. And historians might be able to support that, including in the modern world. But I think there's a note of caution here. In the past, these systems, these social and political systems, focused on powerful and wealthy individuals, operated in a very different way. Like I said, these individuals may not have had the coercive power to maintain stability. So the system was much more fluid, and people could vote with their feet if there was enough space to do so. And in Mongolia, there would have been enough space to do so, right? Which is why I think, there's this tendency to always revert back to dispersed populations. So these early individualizing societies would have been quite unstable because of a lack of access to coercive power, ideological power. Maybe they were unable to provide enough material, economic incentives to their followers over a long period of time. And the more dislocated the system, the more unstable it is, the more unlikely it is to last a long time. If you're looking at Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt and the pharaohs, you're looking at a totally different place. I mean, in Egypt, you have a circumscribed population within the Nile Delta. And in this case, the connection to the gods, the ideological system was such that people felt the need to belong and to support the pharaoh, and there was also coercion there as well, of course, as there was in Mesopotamia. So by that time, in those parts of the world, these early states provided, that extra level of opportunity for would-be leaders, kings and pharaohs, to control their population and ensure stability. So if that is so, and that's true, of course, in the modern world, where leaders can access those other sources of power, for example, coercion. In the ancient world, I think it was a lot harder to maintain that kind of cohesion if people had the ability to move away and stop supporting you, especially if the leader had nothing but access to the gods and ideology to convince you to stay. So I think the two cases provide opportunities for comparison in a critical sense, but they're still different. The ancient world was different in that sense, I think. Do you agree?